Hello, my name is Mr. Codilla, and today I'm going to show you how to do wet into wet watercolor painting. Before me I have a 4th grade project here. I'm going to go ahead and grab one color. I'll start painting in this large circle. Wet into wet watercolor painting, just as the name implies, just as the name means, is you're going to be putting wet watercolor paint into already wet watercolor paint that's already on the paper there. So I'll go ahead and get my paper moist here with one color. You could even just use water for your first layer instead of having to use a color, but I'm going to go ahead and use a color instead right now. The key is to make sure that your paper stays nice and damp, that you don't let it dry out as you're doing wet into wet. Of course, then it would be wet into dry. So we're going to make sure it stays nice and moist. I even take a little bit of water sometimes, and I add it just a little bit there, just to make sure it's nice and moist. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a second color. Maybe I'll grab some orange right here. And I can drop that in. And you see what it does? The water kind of helps move it around. Now, if it is a little too dry, you can go back and just barely touch it with some water here, and it'll move around a little bit more. You don't want to add too much. I'll go ahead and grab maybe some red here as well. I'll use colors that are a little bit closer to yellow for this one, although you could use very different colors. I could go over this with black. You see how the water just moves it around? What's kind of really neat about wet into wet watercolor painting is that when you paint it, it looks very, very different from each piece of paper. No two techniques turn out the same. I'm going to go ahead and turn off this light so it gets that glare out of the way. There you go. Now, when you paint wet into wet watercolor, the different colors will react to each other differently depending on how much water you have. If you put a ton of water down, they'll mix a whole lot. If you only put a little bit of water down, they'll just mix just a little bit. What's kind of neat is you see this paint mixing in with that one. I think that's really beautiful right there. I wouldn't suggest using a lot of different colors for your wet into wet watercolor technique, meaning probably don't want to use like 7 or 8 colors. Then it just starts turning into just brown, unless that's what you really want. I'll go ahead and get some green here. I'm going to drop this into my red. Now, since these are actually opposite colors, I'm going to be very careful with how I do this, because if I mix them too much, it'll just turn into a brown. So I just let the water do the work, and that's how you do wet into wet watercolor painting.